Among the many names that echo through the legends of King Arthur, Arthur himself, noble Lancelot, faithful Guinevere, and the mysterious Merlin. There is one figure who stands apart, cloaked in shadow and shrouded in fear: Morgan Le Fay. To some, she is the sorceress of betrayal, weaving spells of destruction against Arthur's court. To others, she is a healer, a priestess, and a guardian of ancient wisdom suppressed by later chroniclers. But above all, Morgan embodies the tension between light and darkness, between reverence and demonization, between memory and myth. She is the dark enchantress whose story refuses to die, no matter how many times it has been rewritten. Why has Morgan Le Fay endured as one of the most complex and controversial women in Western mythology? The answer lies not just in the tales of Arthurian knights, but in the very fabric of medieval culture itself. For in her image, we see the collision of two worlds, the fading echoes of Celtic paganism and the rising dominance of Christianity. Morgan stands at that crossroads, her character twisted and reshaped by scribes who sought to turn an ancient goddess into a dangerous witch. And yet, despite centuries of demonization, something of her original power still shines through. The power of a woman unafraid to wield knowledge, magic, and authority in a world that tried to silence her. As we embark on this journey, we will trace Morgan's origins, exploring the myths that shaped her before she ever stepped into the pages of Le Morte d'Arthur. We will examine how authors cast her alternately as healer, seductress, trickster, and foe. We will confront the archetype of the Enchantress itself, why societies fear women who possess both wisdom and independence. And finally, we will uncover how Morgan has been reimagined in modern culture, no longer a mere villain, but a mirror reflecting our own anxieties and fascinations with feminine power. This is not just the story of a character in old romances. It is the story of how cultures rewrite their myths to control or to liberate. And Morgan Le Fay, whether as fairy queen or fallen priestess, still whispers through those stories with a voice that cannot be silenced. Long before she was painted as the scheming sorceress of Arthurian romance, Morgan Le Fay may have had her roots in the older traditions of Celtic mythology. The very name Le Fay speaks volumes. It carries the echoes of the word fey, suggesting fairy, otherworldly, and magical ancestry. This was not a woman born of the ordinary world, but of the liminal realm, where gods, spirits, and mortals collide. Some scholars trace her lineage to Irish figures like the Morrigan, a war goddess associated with fate, prophecy, and the sovereignty of kings. Others connect her to Welsh traditions of shape-shifting goddesses who guided and tested heroes on their journeys. What unites these threads is the image of a woman who stood at the threshold between life and death, fate and choice, power and peril. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, gave one of the earliest literary mentions of Morgan in his Vita Merlini. Here, she was not yet a villainess, but a healer of extraordinary gifts, dwelling on the mystical Isle of Avalon. Geoffrey describes her as skilled in astronomy, medicine, and magic, a figure closer to a wise queen or a priestess than the dark enchantress she would later become. In this depiction, Morgan embodies remnants of ancient goddesses, sovereign rulers of sacred isles, women who commanded respect and authority in pre-Christian traditions. This is a Morgan connected with wisdom, healing, and the hidden sciences of nature. Yet as the centuries passed, Christian chroniclers began reshaping her. The very qualities that made Morgan powerful, her knowledge of herbs, her healing arts, her control over the unseen, were recast as dangerous, her independence branded as rebellion, her magic transformed into malice. In a world where the church increasingly defined the boundaries of acceptable belief, female power outside the church's sanction became threatening. Thus, the priestess was recast as the witch. Morgan Le Fay became not a guardian of Avalon, but a shadowy force working against Arthur, against Camelot, and against the ideals of knightly virtue. It is crucial to understand this evolution, because it reflects more than just the development of a single character. It reveals a cultural struggle, the erasure of pagan memory under the weight of Christian orthodoxy. Morgan, in many ways, became the scapegoat for a world that feared the remnants of older spiritual traditions. She absorbed the anxieties of the medieval mind about women, magic, and the other world. By turning her into a villainess, the chroniclers of Arthurian legend sought to contain and control the power she represented. And yet, despite this demonization, Morgan's early aura as a healer and fairy queen never fully disappeared. The Isle of Avalon remained her home, and in whispers of legend, she still waits there, timeless and eternal. She is the guardian of mysteries that defy neat categorization, a reminder that beneath the mask of the witch lies something older, deeper, and far more powerful. As Arthurian legend evolved across Europe, Morgan Le Fay's image transformed dramatically, reflecting not only shifting cultural values, but also the anxieties of the societies retelling her story. In the romances of Chrétien de Troyes, written in the late 12th century, Morgan emerges in more elaborate form. She appears as both healer and enchantress, a figure hovering between benevolence and danger. At times, she is invoked as a guardian of knights, offering healing and protection. At other times, she is seen plotting against Arthur and his companions, testing their strength and virtue. This duality, already present in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Avalon Queen, now became a narrative tension that would define her role in the Arthurian tradition. By the 15th century, Thomas Malory's Les Mortes d'Arthur cemented Morgan's position as one of the most complex characters in the legend. Malory depicts her as Arthur's half-sister, daughter of Igraine, making her kin to the very king she often sought to undermine. This blood tie deepens her character. Her betrayals are not simply the actions of an outsider, but of family. Morgan steals Excalibur's scabbard, sends enchanted gifts to ensnare knights, and conspires to bring Arthur down. Yet at the same time, she is portrayed as a skilled healer and even plays a role in Arthur's final journey to Avalon. In Malory's account, Morgan is never fully severed from her role as caretaker, even when she embodies the antagonist. The tension in her portrayal speaks volumes about the medieval worldview. Writers shaped Morgan into both a warning and a fascination. To the chivalric mind, she embodied temptation, deception, and the dangers of unbridled feminine power. To audiences, She was unforgettable, precisely because she could not be confined to a single role. She was sister and enemy, healer and destroyer, fairy and witch. Each storyteller reshaped her to fit their moral framework, and in doing so, revealed the deeper struggle of their age, the attempt to reconcile pagan remnants with Christian morality. What is particularly striking is the way Morgan's presence contrasts with other women of Arthurian legend. Guinevere is defined largely by her role as queen and lover. The Lady of the Lake remains a mystical yet distant benefactor, but Morgan refuses to be confined to passive roles. She acts, she plots, she heals, she punishes. Her active agency, especially when viewed through the lens of medieval gender norms, was both shocking and compelling. She became a canvas on which authors projected fears of female independence, yet also a vehicle for exploring the ambiguities of power and morality. In the grand tapestry of Arthurian literature, Morgan Le Fay's complexity ensured her survival. While many characters faded into the background, she endured, precisely because she could not be easily categorized. Villain or ally, sorceress or priestess, she remained all of these at once, embodying the contradictions of an age caught between myth and morality. To understand Morgan Le Fay's enduring role in legend, we must step beyond her individual story and explore the archetype she came to embody: the dark enchantress. In the medieval imagination, there was no figure more unsettling than a woman who wielded knowledge and power outside the sanctioned boundaries of church and patriarchy. Morgan became the perfect vessel for this fear. Her identity as sorceress was less about her actual deeds and more about the anxieties projected onto her by the culture that retold her story. The archetype of the Enchantress has always been double-edged. On one side, she represents wisdom, healing, and access to the mysteries of nature, gifts often inherited from ancient goddesses or priestesses. On the other side, she is demonized as a corrupter, seducer, and destroyer of men's virtue. Morgan embodies both aspects. She is depicted mixing herbs, studying the stars, and practicing the arts of healing. Knowledge revered in older traditions, but feared in Christianized Europe. The very traits that once made her a guide now became signs of danger. This transformation reveals more about society's values than about Morgan herself. The witch trials of later centuries would follow the same pattern. Women who practiced herbal medicine, midwifery, or independent spirituality were branded as servants of the devil. In Morgan's case, her literary image was twisted to fit the archetype of the dangerous woman: beautiful, intelligent, and independent, but therefore suspect. She was the shadow cast by patriarchal ideals of submissive femininity. Morgan's tension with other Arthurian women illustrates this archetype clearly. The Lady of the Lake, for example, is ultra-magical, but she exists within the framework of aiding Arthur and his knights. She is mysterious, but ultimately benevolent. Morgan, however, is independent of Arthur's cause. She acts according to her own will, and that autonomy is precisely what makes her threatening. She mirrors the fear of female agency that could not be contained within the ideal of Christian womanhood. Yet, to dismiss her as merely a villainess is to miss the deeper significance of her role. Morgan, as the dark enchantress, represents the suppressed face of feminine divinity. She is the shadow that appears when one side of a truth is ignored. For every lady of the lake, radiant and compliant, there must also be a Morgan, untamed, dangerous, and necessary. She reminds us that wisdom often comes through darkness, and that power, when demonized, does not disappear. It transforms into myth. The archetype of the dark enchantress endures precisely because it is unresolved. Audiences are drawn to Morgan, not despite her ambiguity, but because of it. She is a mirror of the fears, desires, and contradictions we carry about feminine power. Through her, medieval storytellers expressed their cultural anxieties. And through her, modern audiences rediscover a figure too rich to be confined to villainy alone. No exploration of Morgan Le Fay is complete without confronting her turbulent relationship with King Arthur and his knights. Unlike distant antagonists who threaten from outside, Morgan's position is intimate. She is Arthur's half-sister, sharing blood with the very king she often seeks to undermine. This closeness makes her betrayals sting sharper, but it also makes her role far more layered. She is not simply an enemy of Camelot. She is family, bound to the king by origin, yet divided from him by destiny. One of the most famous tales involves her theft of Excalibur's scabbard. Unlike the sword itself, the scabbard was said to grant invulnerability, ensuring that wounds would never prove fatal. By stealing it, Morgan struck at Arthur's very lifeline, not with open combat, but with cunning foresight. This act reveals her as both strategist and trickster, an adversary who understands that true power often lies not in brute force, but in subtlety and calculation. Beyond Arthur, Morgan's interactions with the Knights of the Round Table expose her as a relentless tester of character. In several romances, she sends enchanted gifts to the knights, cloaks that burn the wearer, shields that reveal hidden truths, or rings that entrap their pride. These are not random cruelties, but deliberate ordeals. She becomes a figure who exposes the weaknesses beneath the chivalric facade, revealing how easily honor can collapse under the weight of vanity, lust, or fear. In this way, she plays a role that is strangely similar to that of a spiritual teacher, forcing knights to confront their flaws, even if her methods are merciless. Morgan's relationship with Guinevere adds yet another layer to the drama. The rivalry between the two women is often painted in terms of jealousy, with Morgan plotting against the queen or revealing her affairs. Yet beneath the surface, this rivalry can be read as a symbolic conflict between two models of femininity. Guinevere represents the acceptable ideal, queenly, devoted to Arthur, though flawed in her love for Lancelot. Morgan, by contrast, represents the dangerous alternative, independent, magical, and unconstrained by marital duty. Their conflict is less about personal spite and more about a cultural struggle over which version of womanhood would define the Arthurian world. What makes Morgan so compelling is the ambiguity of her motives. She is not a mindless villain, nor is she a pure heroine. At times, she appears to genuinely care for Arthur, even tending to him after battle. In some traditions, she is one of the women who carries the wounded king to Avalon, suggesting that despite all betrayals, she remains bound to him in the end. Morgan is therefore not merely an enemy of Camelot, but also its hidden mirror, revealing its cracks, testing its heroes, and ensuring that Arthur's reign is never free from shadow. Her clashes with Arthur and his knights reflect a deeper truth about myth. Every golden age is haunted by its shadow, and Morgan Le Fay is that shadow for Camelot. If we peel back the layers of Morgan Le Fay's legend, what emerges is not merely a sorceress at war with Arthur, but an embodiment of the feminine shadow, the aspects of womanhood that patriarchal culture sought to suppress, demonize, or erase. In this sense, Morgan becomes more than a character. She becomes an archetype, a vessel through which society wrestled with its fear of female autonomy. Morgan's dual image as healer and destroyer captures this paradox perfectly. In her earliest depictions, she is skilled in medicine, herbs, and astrology, a custodian of knowledge that once belonged to priestesses and wise women. Yet that same knowledge, reframed by Christian chroniclers, becomes witchcraft, sorcery, and rebellion. The shift tells us less about Morgan herself and more about how feminine wisdom was rebranded as dangerous once it no longer fit the sanctioned worldview. What once healed was reimagined as harmful. What once blessed was condemned as a curse. This tension reveals Morgan as the shadow of Camelot itself. The shining court of Arthur, with its codes of chivalry and Christian virtue, could not exist without casting something into darkness. Morgan became the repository of that shadow. She bore the qualities that knights and kings denied in themselves: ambition, cunning, passion, independence, and raw power. By making Morgan the villainess, the legend allowed Camelot to imagine itself as pure and noble, while projecting its own contradictions onto her. Yet the shadow is never only destructive. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is also the source of hidden potential, the raw energy that, once integrated, brings wholeness. Morgan's role in Arthurian legend reflects this same paradox. When she tests knights, she exposes their weaknesses not to annihilate them, but to force growth. When she undermines Arthur, she reveals that his power is not absolute, that kingship without humility is fragile. Even her acts of apparent betrayal carry an undercurrent of revelation, reminding us that the shadow is as much teacher as adversary. Her rivalry with Guinevere is another reflection of this duality. Guinevere, though flawed, is tolerated within the system of Camelot. She represents femininity that plays by the rules of courtly love and queenly duty. Morgan, by contrast, refuses to conform. She is unruly, magical, and defiant of patriarchal structures. Their conflict dramatizes the cultural split between the accepted and the rejected forms of womanhood, a split that still resonates today. Ultimately, Morgan Le Fay personifies the truth that what a culture represses will not vanish. It will return in myth, story, and archetype. She is the eternal reminder that the feminine cannot be silenced without consequence. In her shadowed figure lies both the fear and the hope of integration, a call to remember that light and dark are inseparable, and that power denied becomes power transformed. Though centuries have passed since medieval scribes first inked her name onto parchment, Morgan Le Fay has never vanished. Instead, she has been reborn again and again, each age reshaping her into a figure that reflects its own fears, desires, and questions about power. In the Romantic and Gothic movements of the 18th and 19th centuries, she was portrayed with dark allure, a temptress cloaked in mystery, embodying the fascination with the supernatural that captivated audiences of that time. Artists and poets painted her as both dangerous and irresistible, reviving her image as a femme fatale for a new era. By the 20th century, Morgan's legend took on fresh dimensions through novels and popular media. One of the most influential reinterpretations came with Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon, which reframed Morgan, not as villain, but as heroine. In this retelling, she is Morgaine, the priestess of the old religion, struggling to preserve pagan traditions against the encroaching power of Christianity. Here, Morgan becomes not the destroyer of Camelot, but its forgotten conscience, representing a worldview silenced by history. This perspective resonated deeply with modern readers, especially as societies began questioning patriarchal structures and reclaiming suppressed voices. Film and television have also seized upon Morgan's enduring allure. In adaptations of Arthurian tales, she often appears as the dark sorceress, clad in flowing robes, weaving enchantments to entrap knights and defy Arthur. Yet increasingly, these portrayals reveal her complexity, casting her not just as evil, but as conflicted, wounded, and tragically human. She is no longer a flat antagonist. She is a mirror of ambition, betrayal, resilience, and the struggle for autonomy. Why does Morgan remain so compelling to modern culture? Because she speaks to questions we still wrestle with today. How do societies treat women who refuse to conform? How do we reconcile traditions of wisdom and spirituality that have been demonized by dominant narratives? How do we face the shadow side of power, both within ourselves and within our history? Morgan's story invites us to confront these questions not as abstract debates, but through the living symbol of a woman who has walked with us for nearly 1,000 years in myth. Even now, Morgan's archetype extends beyond literature. She appears in fantasy novels, comic books, video games, and modern spirituality, her image morphing to fit each medium. Sometimes she is a supervillain, sometimes a mentor, sometimes a goddess reclaiming her rightful place. The constant across all these interpretations is her refusal to be forgotten. Every retelling, whether reverent or hostile, ensures that Morgan's voice continues to echo. In the end, Morgan Le Fay's endurance in modern culture shows us that archetypes cannot be destroyed. They only transform. The sorceress of Avalon is still alive, reminding us that beneath every legend lies a truth that demands to be remembered. Power, once buried, always returns. As we bring this journey to a close, one truth becomes clear. Morgan Le Fay is far more than a supporting character in the Arthurian cycle. She is the shadow behind the throne, the whisper in the halls of Camelot, the reminder that no golden age exists without its darkness. From her earliest roots as a healer and priestess to her later portrayal as the feared Enchantress, Morgan embodies the paradox of feminine power, revered and reviled, honored and condemned, remembered and erased. Her story reflects the tension between pagan memory and Christian rewriting, between ancient reverence for the goddess and medieval fear of the witch. Yet despite every attempt to contain her, Morgan has endured. She refuses to vanish from cultural memory, resurfacing again and again in poetry, art, novels, and film. Each new age finds in her what it most fears and most desires: the defiant woman, the keeper of forbidden wisdom, the enchantress who refuses silence. And perhaps that is why Morgan still speaks to us today. She is not simply a relic of medieval imagination, but a living archetype that continues to evolve. For some, she is the villainess who destroyed Camelot's dream. For others, she is the suppressed goddess, carrying the wisdom of Avalon into the modern age. But for all, she is a reminder that power cannot be erased, only hidden, distorted, or transformed. In the end, Morgan Le Fay's legacy is not just about betrayal or sorcery. It is about the stories we tell to define power, gender, and truth. She shows us how myths shape culture, and how culture, in turn, reshapes myths. Her presence across the centuries proves that no legend ever dies completely. The Enchantress of Avalon continues to haunt us because she is in any ways part of us. The shadow we fear, the mystery we seek, and the power we cannot deny. So the question remains, was Morgan truly the villain of Arthurian legend? Or was she the hidden key to its wisdom? The answer may never be final, and perhaps that is the point. For Morgan Le Fay, the dark enchantress will always remain just beyond the edge of certainty, waiting in the mists of Avalon.